My family gave my brother the sprawling waterfront estate and the brand new boat, telling me I did not need any of it because I was too independent. I sold my only car just to afford a security deposit on a small apartment and moved to Chicago. 5 years later, on Christmas morning, my father called demanding I wire $250,000 to save my brother from drowning in his own debt. When I calmly told him no, he did not just throw a tantrum. He accidentally set off a chain of events that revealed my family had stolen my identity. If you have ever been treated as the financial backup plan for the favorite child, drop your city in the comments and let me know I am not alone. Hit the like button and subscribe if you know the exhaustion of being punished for being responsible. Let me tell you how the daughter they threw away became the landlord they could not escape. I am 30 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for a major financial firm in downtown Chicago. My daily life revolves around uncovering corporate fraud, tracking hidden assets, and untangling complex webs of deceit. I spend my days analyzing data models and exposing people who think they are smart enough to beat the system. I built my life on raw logic and predictable math. I engineered my existence this way on purpose to escape the toxic emotional chaos of my biological family. I had not spoken to my parents or my brother Julian since a tense and brief phone call on Thanksgiving. So when my phone vibrated against the granite countertop of my kitchen at 8 in the morning on Christmas Day, I knew it was not a festive holiday greeting. The wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the glass of my high-rise windows. I looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed my father, Richard. I placed the phone on the island, poured my black coffee, and tapped the speaker button. My father did not say hello. He bypassed all standard social pleasantries. His voice was frantic, carrying a desperate, chaotic energy that instantly invaded my quiet sanctuary. He told me Julian was losing the Lake Geneva house. The bank was moving in aggressively with foreclosure proceedings. He said Julian was drowning in debt from an equity line, and they needed me to wire $250,000 by the end of the weekend to halt the legal process. He demanded I initiate the transfer immediately so the funds would clear when the banks opened. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the dark liquid coat the ceramic mug. I asked him to repeat the sum, just to ensure my analytical brain had processed his audacity correctly. He did. I told him my money belonged to me, and Julian's debts belonged to Julian. My father instantly lost his temper. The desperate tone evaporated, replaced by vicious entitlement. He told me I was sitting in a sterile high-rise hoarding my corporate salary while my own flesh and blood was facing the street. He called me a heartless corporate elite. He said I was an unnatural daughter who cared more about spreadsheets than family loyalty. I asked him a very simple logical question. I asked why I should drain my hard-earned savings to rescue a house they had explicitly banned me from inheriting. He told me it was the family legacy. I told him it was Julian's legacy, and Julian could sell his luxury toys to save it. Then I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the counter. The silence returned to my apartment, but the tranquility was fundamentally fractured. The financial audacity of his demand was standard operating procedure for my parents. Yet something about the sheer panicked terror in my father's voice felt completely out of the usual algorithm. He was not just begging for charity. He was terrified of a consequence. To understand the sheer weight of that phone call, you have to go back half a decade. You have to look at the exact moment my parents drew a line in the sand and placed me on the wrong side of it. 5 years ago, they summoned me to our ancestral family home. I sat across the polished mahogany table from my brother Julian, watching my parents slide a stack of legal documents between us. They announced they were transferring the deed of the Lake Geneva estate wholly to him. Lake Geneva, Wisconsin is the playground of the wealthy, a sprawling retreat of deep water access and massive private docks. They did not ask for my opinion. They presented the real estate transfer as a mathematical necessity. My mother, Patricia, patted my hand, using that soft, patronizing tone she reserved for placating difficult children. She told me I was too independent. She said I had my accounting degree, a promising career trajectory, and a brilliant mind. She said I did not need a handout. Then my father delivered the killing blow wrapped in a compliment. He said my competence was a shield. I could survive anything and withstand any storm. Julian, on the other hand, was fragile. Julian was 32 years old and possessed a long history of launching failed startup companies that evaporated within months. He had an uncanny ability to burn through capital. My father looked me in the eye and said Julian needed a stable foundation to finally find his footing. They weaponized my resilience against me. Because I had spent my entire youth studying, working, and ensuring I would never be a financial burden, I was disqualified from the family legacy. Because Julian had spent his youth failing, he was rewarded with a multi-million-dollar waterfront estate. The very next day, they bought him a brand new speedboat. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I simply walked out. That same weekend, I drove my beat-up 10-year-old sedan to a used car lot in a bad part of town. I stood in a cramped office and handed over the title to the only vehicle I owned just to secure a cashier's check that barely covered the first month's rent and security deposit on my Chicago apartment. I built my life from scratch while they polished Julian's unearned crown. Julian had also recently married Maya. Maya is a beautiful African-American woman who works as a lifestyle influencer on social media. She immediately treated the Lake Geneva estate as her personal content studio, filling her feeds with catered parties, expensive designer wardrobes, and a fabricated narrative of endless wealth. 30 seconds after I hung up on my father, my phone lit up again. It was not another phone call. It was a text message from an unknown Wisconsin area code. An image attachment loaded on my screen. It was a scanned legal document. I zoomed in on the pixelated text reading the header. It was a notice of default and foreclosure from a regional bank. I scanned past the Lake Geneva property address. I scanned past Julian's name listed as the primary borrower. My pulse spiked. There at the bottom of the page, resting on the line designated for the financial guarantor, was a signature. I pulled the screen closer to my eyes. The ink formed my name, but the slanted cursive loops unmistakably belonged to my mother, Patricia. To secure his final desperate loan, Julian and my parents had needed a co-signer. They had committed federal identity fraud using my pristine credit score and my corporate income to secure Julian's debt without my knowledge. They did not just give him the house. They secretly chained me to the anchor while the ship went down. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone against the glass window. Working in forensic accounting teaches you that anomalies demand immediate investigation, not emotional meltdowns. I walked over to my home office, opened my secure laptop, and pulled my official credit report. The screen populated with the brutal truth. The betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket of frost. A massive six-figure home equity line of credit sat right there under my active accounts bleeding red with missed payments. But the data trail did not stop there. The foreclosure notice was just the first explosion in a very large minefield. I scrolled further down the digital report. My eyes locked onto 3 separate premium credit cards. All 3 were opened in my name over the last 2 years. All 3 were completely maxed out. I looked at the charging history. The ledger painted a vivid portrait of exactly where the money had gone. There were charges for luxury boutiques in Miami, first-class flights to Dubai, and high-end cosmetic procedures. The exact lifestyle Maya flaunted daily to her 500,000 followers was entirely funded by my stolen identity. My family had not merely leveraged my name to save a house. They had treated my flawless financial profile as an endless ATM for a golden child and his influencer wife who refused to live within the boundaries of reality. My phone vibrated again. Another text message appeared on the screen, this time directly from my mother. It read, "We are coming to your office first thing on Monday. We need to handle this as a family." I stared at the words, absorbing the sheer entitlement dripping from the digital text. They forged my signature on bank loans, risked my entire financial future, committed federal wire fraud, and now expected to walk into my corporate workplace to demand a cash bailout. They thought I was still the quiet, obedient girl who packed her boxes in silence and drove away 5 years ago. They thought my competence was still a tool they could easily wield for Julian's benefit. I closed the browser on my laptop and picked up my phone. The coldness that had settled over my shoulders began to harden into something sharp, precise, and completely devoid of mercy. I was no longer a discarded daughter. I was an apex predator in a financial ecosystem they did not even begin to understand, and they had just walked directly into my trap. I pressed the end call button on my screen and dropped the phone onto the granite counter. The sudden silence in my kitchen was heavy, but my mind immediately pulled me back to a specific afternoon exactly 5 years ago. I was sitting across from my parents in their formal dining room. They had summoned me there to make an announcement. Without a single ounce of hesitation, my father pushed a stack of legal papers across the polished wood table and calmly declared they were transferring the deed of the Lake Geneva estate entirely to my brother Julian. They did not stop at the multi-million-dollar property. They also handed him the keys to a brand new luxury speedboat. When I asked why I was being completely cut out of the family legacy, my mother offered me a soft and patronizing smile. She told me Julian was fragile. She said he was weak and desperately needed a solid financial foundation to survive in the real world. Then she looked at me and delivered the ultimate insult, disguised as a compliment. She said I was simply too independent. Because I had spent my entire youth studying, working, and building my own competence, I was disqualified from their support. They weaponized my resilience against me. I did not argue and I did not shed a single tear. I simply stood up and walked out of the house. The brutal contrast of what happened the very next day is permanently burned into my memory. While Julian was busy picking out custom upholstery for his free boat, I was standing in a cramped office at a shady used car lot. I handed over the title to my beat-up 10-year-old sedan. I had to sell my only mode of transportation just to scrape together enough cash for a security deposit on a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Chicago. I built my entire existence from absolute zero, while they handed my brother an empire he did absolutely nothing to earn. Exactly 30 seconds after I hung up on my father, my phone illuminated again. It was not another frantic phone call. It was a text message from an unknown local area code. An image attachment slowly loaded on the display. It was a scanned legal document. I zoomed in on the pixelated text at the top of the page, identifying it as an official notice of default and foreclosure from a regional bank. I scanned past the property address of the Lake Geneva estate. I scanned past Julian's name clearly listed as the primary borrower. My pulse spiked, but my hands remained perfectly steady. There, at the absolute bottom of the page, resting on the line legally designated for the financial guarantor, was a signature. I pulled the screen closer to my eyes, studying the ink. The letters spelled out my name, but I had never signed this piece of paper in my entire life. The cursive was elegant and highly practiced. I recognized the distinctive slanted loops on the capital letters immediately. It was the unmistakable handwriting of my mother, Patricia. They did not just hand Julian the family estate. To secure his final desperate loan, my own parents had stolen my financial identity and quietly chained me to his sinking ship. A lesser person might have shattered their phone or collapsed into a puddle of grief. I did neither of those things. Working in forensic accounting rewires your response to chaos. You learn very quickly that anomalies demand investigation, not emotion. I simply walked over to my desk and opened my secure laptop. I needed to see the full scope of the infection. I navigated to a federal credit monitoring portal and pulled my comprehensive report. I expected to see the fraudulent mortgage sitting there bleeding red across my pristine financial history. What I found was a second bomb waiting to detonate. The data populated on the glowing screen, and the betrayal settled over my shoulders like a heavy, suffocating weight. The home equity line of credit was just the beginning of the disaster. I scrolled further down the digital ledger, and my eyes locked onto 3 separate premium credit cards. All 3 of these high-limit accounts were opened in my name. All 3 of them were completely maxed out to the absolute limit. My family had not just hijacked my identity for a single desperate real estate loan to save Julian's house. They had systematically stolen my name 2 years ago. They had turned my flawless credit score into their own private bank account, and they had drained it completely dry. My hands flew across the keyboard of my laptop. As a forensic accountant, I do not deal in assumptions or family gossip. I deal in paper trails and hard data. I bypassed the standard credit reporting sites and dug deeper, accessing the Walworth County Public Records database. I needed to see exactly how much leverage they had pulled against the Lake Geneva property, and more importantly, where every single dollar had gone. I began cross-referencing the dates on the forged home equity line with the transaction histories on the 3 maxed-out credit cards. It took me less than 45 minutes to completely dismantle the illusion my family had carefully built. Julian always portrayed himself as a brilliant visionary on the verge of his next big entrepreneurial breakthrough. My father constantly defended Julian's need for capital, claiming the money was being invested in high-yield startups and operational costs. The digital ledger told a completely different story. The funds were not going toward business licenses, payroll, or commercial inventory. The accounts were hemorrhaging cash directly into luxury retail and international travel. I matched a $15,000 withdrawal to the exact date a limited edition Hermes bag was purchased. I tracked another massive string of charges to luxury resorts and first-class flights. I pulled up Maya's social media accounts on my second monitor. My sister-in-law had built her entire online persona around being an elite lifestyle influencer. I stared at a perfectly curated video of Maya sipping champagne in a private beach cabana in Tulum. The date of the post aligned flawlessly with a $12,000 charge on a credit card legally tied to my Social Security number. I clicked on another photo of her posing in front of a five-star hotel in Dubai. The flights and the penthouse suite were paid for using the equity they stole from the house. Julian was not a struggling businessman victimized by a tough economy. He was a fraud. He and Maya were actively financing their fake millionaire internet lifestyle by draining my actual reality. My phone began to vibrate against the edge of my desk. It was not a single notification. It was a relentless, continuous buzz that rattled the wood. I picked up the device and saw a flood of incoming text messages. I opened the first one from a distant cousin. It contained nothing but a link to a video and a message calling me a monster. I clicked the link, and the screen loaded a video on a popular social media app. Maya had cultivated an audience of over 500,000 followers on that platform. The video was shot in the standard "get ready with me" style. Maya sat in her massive walk-in closet at the Lake Geneva house, crying softly while applying expensive foundation with a beauty blender. She looked directly into the camera lens and delivered a masterful performance of absolute victimhood. She did not use my actual name, but the context was unmistakable. She sobbed about the heartbreak of having a cold-blooded biological sister who makes millions at a massive Chicago corporation. She dabbed her eyes and told her audience that this sister was choosing to sit in her luxury high-rise and watch her own flesh and blood get thrown out onto the street. She even dragged her 2-year-old son into the narrative, weaponizing my nephew by claiming a toddler was about to be homeless just because his wealthy aunt was too selfish to help. The comment section was a digital witch hunt. 500,000 strangers were sharpening their pitchforks aggressively, demanding the internet hunt down the identity of this evil corporate sister. The smear campaign was working exactly as she designed it. My notification screen quickly turned into a digital war zone. The flying monkeys of my extended family network descended without hesitation. Aunts, uncles, and cousins flooded my inbox with pure venom. They called me a disgrace to the bloodline. They demanded I drain my savings to save an innocent child from the consequences of my cruelty. Maya thought public shame would break my boundaries. She assumed a mob of angry followers and judgmental relatives would terrify me into writing a massive check just to buy back my peace. She thought she could bully me into submission using the court of public opinion. She completely underestimated the woman she was trying to destroy. I watched the notification counter climb higher and higher on my phone screen. I did not draft a frantic defense. I did not jump into the comment section of her video to plead my case. Engaging with a smear campaign only gives manipulators the drama they desperately crave. I employed a psychological strategy known as gray rocking. You become as uninteresting and unresponsive as a plain gray rock. When toxic people try to provoke you, they are hunting for an emotional reaction to use as ammunition. If you give them absolute silence, they eventually starve. I picked up my phone, switched it completely off, and placed it inside a desk drawer. The digital screaming ceased immediately. The room was quiet again. I turned my focus back to my dual monitors. The court of public opinion meant absolutely nothing compared to federal banking laws. I highlighted the digital files containing the home equity line, the forged signature, and the 3 maxed-out credit card statements. I routed the files to the high-speed laser printer sitting in the corner of my home office. The machine hummed to life, spitting out dozens of warm, crisp pages. I printed the public property records. I printed the transaction histories proving Maya bought designer bags and plane tickets with stolen funds. I gathered the massive stack of papers, aligning the edges perfectly against the desktop. I pulled a thick manila folder from my filing cabinet and slid the evidence inside. I let Maya keep her fake internet narrative. I was building a legally binding weapon composed entirely of their own financial crimes. I placed the manila folder on my desk, thinking the investigation was complete. But my forensic training pushed me to run one final query. In my line of work, you never assume you have found the bottom of the barrel until you check the federal databases. I took my Social Security number and ran it through a federal business registry to ensure the financial damage was fully contained. It was not. The system processed the data and populated the screen with a commercial registration document for a limited liability company. I opened the digital file and scanned the articles of organization. Julian was listed as the managing member, but my eyes froze on the line designating the primary corporate director. It was my name. Beside it sat another flawless forgery of my signature. My parents and my brother had not merely stolen my financial identity to secure a mortgage and fund a luxury lifestyle. They had used my pristine legal record to construct a corporate shell company. I pulled the federal tax filings tied to the entity. As an accountant, looking at those numbers felt like staring into an active volcano. The financial reporting was a masterclass in blatant corporate fraud. Julian had been funneling massive amounts of undocumented income through this shell company, claiming entirely fabricated business losses to completely evade federal taxes. The regional bank threatening foreclosure on the Lake Geneva estate was suddenly the least of my problems. The bank just wanted their money. The Internal Revenue Service wants blood. This was severe federal tax evasion. The federal government does not send polite text messages, and they absolutely do not care about toxic family dynamics. They only care about the signature legally binding the corporate charter. If the government audited this shell company, the federal agents would not go looking for Julian. They would come straight to my Chicago high-rise. My family had deliberately set me up to be their legal shield. They built a financial bomb and strapped it directly to my chest. If their house of cards collapsed, I was the one designed to take the fall. If I did not dismantle this operation immediately, I was not just going to lose my credit score and my corporate career. I was going to a federal prison in his place. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, predictable rhythm I usually craved. My office in the Chicago financial district is a sanctuary of logic built with brushed steel and soundproof glass. I sat at my desk reviewing corporate audit files and enjoying the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. Then the intercom on my console buzzed with a sharp electronic tone. I pressed the button and heard the voice of our floor receptionist. She sounded deeply uncomfortable. She apologized for interrupting my workflow, but informed me that 3 people were currently in the main lobby, causing a massive scene. They were loudly demanding to see me and refusing to leave until I came out. I did not even need to ask for their names. The predators had come straight to the trap. My father, Richard, my mother, Patricia, and my brother, Julian, had driven all the way from Wisconsin to downtown Chicago. They had breached the perimeter of my professional life. They assumed the threat of a public spectacle in front of my colleagues and corporate executives would humiliate me into total compliance. They thought I would do anything to keep the peace and protect my professional reputation. I took a slow, measured breath and stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored blazer and walked down the long, polished corridor toward the main reception area. I saw them immediately. They looked entirely out of place in a building dedicated to strict compliance and financial accountability. Julian was pacing angrily near the security turnstiles, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. As he moved, I caught the distinct metallic glint of a heavy stainless steel Rolex on his left wrist. He was wearing a $10,000 luxury watch to an ambush where he planned to beg for my life savings. My mother was clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, while my father was actively raising his voice at a bewildered security guard. I did not greet them. I did not offer a warm family embrace or a polite smile. I walked past the reception desk and gestured sharply toward a vacant glass-walled conference room adjacent to the lobby. I kept my voice incredibly low and authoritative, ordering them to step inside. I absolutely refused to give them the public audience they were trying to weaponize against me. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut, isolating us in the soundproof room, the performance began. My father did not bother to ask how I was doing. He bypassed any mention of the forged signatures or the stolen credit cards. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and slammed a stack of financial withdrawal forms directly onto the center of the conference table. He looked me dead in the eye and stated, rather than ask, that I was going to liquidate my 401k retirement account. He demanded I empty the entire fund I had built through years of grueling corporate labor. He framed this outrageous extortion not as a desperate bailout, but as a temporary family loan. He insisted I sign the penalty release forms right there on the table so the cash could be wired to the regional bank by Wednesday. Julian stood behind him, crossing his arms with an expression of pure, arrogant expectation. They were seriously standing in my own corporate office, ordering me to burn down my future to keep them warm. The conference room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling smart glass, perfectly reflecting the sterile and intimidating lighting of my financial firm. Julian leaned against the heavy oak table, projecting an aura of bored inconvenience rather than the panic of a man facing total financial ruin. My eyes drifted away from the withdrawal forms and landed directly on his left wrist. The cuff of his tailored shirt rode up just enough to reveal a heavy stainless steel timepiece with a distinct ceramic bezel. It was a Rolex Submariner. The retail value of that specific watch easily hovered over $10,000. He was standing inside my corporate sanctuary, actively demanding that I drain the retirement funds I had earned through grueling 60-hour work weeks, all while casually wearing the equivalent of a luxury vehicle on his wrist. It was the absolute perfect physical distillation of his delusional entitlement. Julian operated on a lifelong pattern of ruthless manipulation. He honestly believed that cornering me in my own workplace would trigger my deep-seated fear of public embarrassment. He assumed I would desperately want to avoid a scene in front of my executive colleagues and that I would simply pick up a pen and sign my financial future away just to protect my professional image. He thought the heavy pressure of the corporate environment was his ultimate weapon to force my obedience. He fundamentally failed to realize that this glass tower was my home turf, and I do not negotiate with terrorists in my own boardroom. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not even look at the retirement withdrawal forms my father had slammed onto the table. Instead, I maintained direct eye contact with my family and unzipped my black leather portfolio. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the panic they expected to see. I extracted the thick manila folder I had compiled over the weekend and tossed it directly over his fabricated rescue plan. The heavy stack of papers hit the oak table with a loud, commanding thud. I kept my voice perfectly level, employing the exact tone I used to brief corporate executives on severe financial liabilities. I told them I was not going to liquidate a single cent of my retirement. I instructed my father to open the folder. I watched the arrogant expectation completely drain from his face as his eyes scanned the top document. It was the high-resolution scan of the forged home equity line of credit, followed immediately by the 3 maxed-out premium credit card statements. But I did not stop there. I reached over and flipped to the final document in the stack, exposing the federal commercial registration and the tax filings for the shell company Julian had established. I pointed directly to the forged signatures. I explained in crisp analytical detail that I knew exactly what they had done. I laid out the federal wire fraud, the identity theft, and the massive tax evasion operation. Julian was actively running through a limited liability company, illegally registered in my name. The air in the soundproof conference room grew incredibly thin. My mother turned an ashen gray, pressing her hand to her chest, as she realized their absolute worst nightmare was sitting right in front of them in the form of undeniable municipal data. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and looked at my watch. I told them they had exactly 2 minutes to exit the building. I stated that if they were not completely through the security turnstiles, by the time those 2 minutes expired, I would have corporate security forcefully escort them out, and I would personally request they notify the local Chicago police regarding an active extortion attempt. My father froze, but Julian could not handle the rejection. The golden child was not accustomed to hearing the word no, let alone being ordered out of a room by the sister he viewed as his personal ATM. He lunged forward and slammed both of his hands onto the polished surface of the table. The loud smack echoed within the soundproof walls like a sharp crack of violence. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He leaned across the table until he was inches from my face and snarled his threat. He told me that if I let the bank take his house, the auditors would flag the entire file. He yelled that my name was on the corporate charter, and if the government came after him for tax evasion, he was going to swear under oath that I was his active accomplice. He promised with absolute malice that if he was going down, he was going to drag me into a federal prison right alongside him. Julian turned and stormed out of the conference room with my parents trailing frantically behind him. He honestly believed his parting threat was a tactical strike that would paralyze me with fear. He thought promising mutual destruction would finally force me to liquidate my retirement. Instead, he handed me the exact clarity and proof of malicious intent I required. His threat did not terrify me. It liberated me. I walked back to my desk, picked up the thick manila folder, and grabbed my car keys. I left the building and drove straight into the heart of the Chicago legal district. I was heading to see Valerie. Valerie is a senior partner at a boutique litigation firm and possesses a formidable reputation as an absolute apex predator in the financial legal sector. She does not operate on emotion. She operates on leverage, precision, and an unsentimental reading of the law. I sat in her mahogany office and laid the entire folder on her desk. When she finished reviewing the forged loan documents and the massive tax evasion files, she looked up and offered to call the federal authorities immediately. She told me we could walk this straight to the district attorney and have my mother and Julian indicted for felony fraud by the end of the month. I shook my head. Sending my mother to a federal prison was too easy and far too noisy. Within the twisted logic of my extended family, putting my mother in a jail cell would transform her into a tragic martyr and make me the ultimate villain. I wanted a punishment that cut straight to the bone. I wanted to completely dismantle their reality without giving them a single drop of sympathy from the public. I instructed Valerie to execute a surgical strike. First, she was to contact the Internal Revenue Service and preemptively file a fraud affidavit, cleanly detaching my identity from the shell company before an audit could even begin. Second, she was to legally sever my name from the toxic bank debt. But my final directive was the absolute most important. I told Valerie to immediately establish an anonymous corporate entity in the state of Wisconsin. I did not just want to clear my name. I wanted to use my own capital to completely buy out the defaulted debt. I was going to purchase their beloved waterfront estate right out from under them, and they would never even see me coming. My legal trap was officially in motion, but toxic families never surrender without launching a final desperate offensive. 48 hours after the ambush in my corporate boardroom, my phone rang late in the evening. I was sitting in my Chicago apartment reviewing the anonymous corporate filings my attorney had just secured. The caller ID displayed my mother. I answered the call and was immediately hit with a wall of hysterical screaming. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. She sobbed violently into the receiver, claiming my father had collapsed on the kitchen floor, clutching his chest. She said he was suffering a massive cardiac event and had been rushed to an emergency room. But she did not call to seek comfort from her daughter. She called to weaponize the medical emergency. She screamed that his heart gave out entirely because of the overwhelming stress of the impending foreclosure. She explicitly blamed me, stating that my refusal to hand over my retirement savings had literally pushed my father to the brink of death. Then came the absolute pinnacle of her emotional manipulation. She demanded I leave Chicago immediately and drive to the medical facility. But she did not just want my physical presence at his bedside. She ordered me to bring my checkbook and the financial transfer paperwork. She cried that the only thing keeping his failing heart beating was the hope that the family legacy could be saved. She told me that if I did not walk into that emergency room ready to pay off Julian's debt, it would be the very last time I ever saw my father alive. She was actively holding his mortality hostage to extort $250,000. I disconnected the call and picked up my car keys. I did not panic, and I certainly did not speed. I drove down the interstate toward the address my mother provided, keeping my vehicle exactly at the posted speed limit. Working in forensic accounting trains your brain to automatically recognize behavioral patterns, and my father possessed a long documented history of developing sudden physical ailments whenever he faced severe accountability. I remembered how this exact dynamic played out throughout our entire lives. Whenever Julian failed a major university exam, my father would conveniently retreat to his bedroom for a week with a mysterious severe back spasm. He used his physical pain as an absolute shield, leaving my mother to handle the academic fallout and coddle her golden son. When Julian's first startup company went bankrupt and the angry investors started calling the house, my father suddenly developed debilitating migraines that prevented him from answering the phone or attending any financial meetings. His biology always provided a highly convenient escape hatch whenever reality became too difficult to manage. I pulled my car into the parking lot of the medical facility my mother had texted me. I put the car in park and studied the building through my windshield. The physical location itself completely exposed the manipulation before I even walked inside. If my father were truly experiencing a catastrophic and life-threatening cardiac event, emergency medical responders would have immediately routed his ambulance to a major hospital with a specialized cardiac intensive care unit. This was not a hospital. It was a small local walk-in clinic wedged into a suburban strip mall right next to a retail pharmacy. It was a basic medical facility designed to treat sprained ankles, minor cuts, and seasonal allergies. It was absolutely not equipped to handle a massive heart attack. The theatrical performance was incredibly transparent, but I stepped out of my car and walked through the automatic sliding glass doors anyway, fully prepared to watch the actors play their parts. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to examination room 4. My mother sat in a plastic visitor chair, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, but her makeup was absolutely flawless. A woman who genuinely feared her husband was dying would not look like she was ready for a country club luncheon. My father lay on the examination table wearing a faded cotton gown. A vital signs monitor blinked steadily next to his bed. As an auditor, I always check the raw data before I listen to the narrative. I stepped closer to the bed and looked directly at the glowing screen. His blood pressure read a perfectly stable 120/80. His blood oxygen saturation registered at 99%. The digital numbers told a definitive story of flawless cardiovascular health. An attending nurse stood near the machine, noting figures on a digital tablet. She was a woman in her late 40s, projecting an aura of profound exhaustion. I caught her eye. She looked at the monitor, looked at my father's theatrical grimacing, and then looked directly at me. She did not say a single word. She simply offered a subtle, knowing shake of her head and a slight roll of her eyes. It was a silent, professional confirmation that absolutely nothing was physically wrong with the man on the table. He was experiencing a calculated performance. The nurse offered a tight smile and quietly exited the room. The exact second the medical professional closed the door, my father escalated his routine. He let out a ragged, trembling breath and reached a shaking hand across the crinkling paper of the exam table. He grabbed my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man allegedly hovering near death. He pulled me closer, while his eyes welled with manufactured tears. He whispered that his failing heart simply could not take the strain of watching the family legacy vanish. Then he delivered his ultimate pitch. He told me he had received a tip from the bank that an anonymous corporate buyer was maneuvering to purchase the defaulted loan file. He begged me to liquidate all my savings and use my corporate capital to outbid this faceless corporation. He cried that it was the only way to save the house and preserve our family bloodline. I stood in the sterile examination room looking down at the man clutching my arm. The sheer staggering irony of the situation possessed a cinematic weight. My father was lying in a hospital gown, weaponizing his own fabricated mortality, begging his discarded daughter to give him hundreds of thousands of dollars so he could turn around and hand that exact sum of money directly to my own anonymous shell company. He was actively begging me to pay myself. He expected me to drain the accounts I had built through years of relentless corporate labor to repurchase the very asset they had explicitly banned me from inheriting. He wanted me to buy the house twice, just to maintain the illusion that his golden son had not completely failed. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not laugh in his face. I did not mention the steady, healthy rhythm of the heart monitor or the knowing glance from the attending nurse. I simply let his desperate, twisting narrative hang in the cold air of the clinic room. I gently pried his fingers off my wrist and placed his hand back onto the crinkling paper sheet. I allowed my posture to relax just a fraction, projecting the image of a daughter whose heavy corporate armor had finally been pierced by family guilt. I told him he needed to rest. I said a severe cardiac scare required calm reflection, not frantic financial strategizing. I looked at my mother and told her I would not discuss wire transfers or stock liquidations in an urgent care facility. I agreed to attend a formal family dinner on Thanksgiving to discuss the final financial solution. I looked my father directly in the eye and promised I would bring a comprehensive strategy to the table that would resolve the issue of the faceless corporation permanently. A fleeting shadow of a smile touched the corner of my mother's mouth. She reached over and patted my father's shoulder, executing a silent gesture of absolute victory. They thought they had won. They believed the medical theatrics had successfully softened my resolve, breaking the cold logic I used to protect myself. They thought the compliant backup plan was finally falling back into line, ready to willingly sacrifice her future for their comfort. I turned and walked out of the examination room, leaving them alone with their massive illusions. They thought the sheep had just walked obediently into the trap, but they had absolutely no idea they were the ones being led to the slaughter. The morning of the foreclosure auction arrived with a cold gray overcast that perfectly matched the concrete steps of the Walworth County Courthouse. I did not attend the proceedings in person. I remained sitting comfortably in my glass-walled office in the Chicago financial district, analyzing corporate data sets, while the fate of my family legacy hung entirely in the balance. I poured a cup of black coffee from the break room and settled into my ergonomic chair. My mobile phone rested face up on the brushed steel surface of my desk, connected to a secure line. Wisconsin foreclosure auctions do not happen in glamorous boardrooms or dramatic court settings. They take place outdoors, exposed to the harsh elements and the casual scrutiny of passing traffic. An appointed trustee stands on the courthouse steps and reads a highly technical legal description of the property, rattling off parcel numbers and lot dimensions in a completely flat and unfeeling monotone. The legal process strips the asset of all its emotional history, ignoring the summers spent on the water or the generational legacy supposedly baked into the foundation. A sprawling family sanctuary is reduced to nothing more than a starting bid and a gavel drop. My professional life revolves around managing risk and anticipating financial outcomes. This real estate transaction was simply another data set to control. While I organized numerical models, my parents and brother were descending into unmitigated chaos, eagerly waiting for a rescue they thought I was going to deliver at Thanksgiving. Through the grapevine of gossiping aunts and distant cousins, I learned the full extent of their panic over the past few days. The vicious smear campaign Maya had launched against me had completely dried up on social media, replaced instantly by frantic offline pleas for liquidity. Julian spent the final 48 hours calling every relative he knew, begging for a last-minute bailout. He offered unrealistic returns on investment and equity shares in non-existent startups. No one wrote him a single check. Wealthy families excel at protecting their own capital, and the toxic stench of my brother's financial ruin repelled any potential investors. My phone buzzed against the desk as the auction commenced. Valerie, my corporate attorney, was on the line representing Silent Waters, LLC. I authorized her to act with absolute surgical precision. Armed with my liquid capital and a pre-approved commercial loan secured against my vested corporate stock options, she stood on those concrete steps ready to execute the acquisition. The strategy was incredibly straightforward. The regional lender merely wanted to recover its massive losses. Local real estate investors hunting for a quick bargain would naturally drop out once the bidding approached the actual market value of a premium Lake Geneva waterfront estate. I instructed Valerie to push completely past the standard investor threshold. I was not looking for a quick property flip. I was securing absolute leverage. The trustee opened the bidding at exactly 10 in the morning. Valerie narrated the events to me in short clinical bursts over the speakerphone. A handful of local property developers threw in initial numbers, testing the waters and looking for a heavily discounted asset. Valerie countered their offers immediately. She raised the increments by $50,000 per bid to signal formidable institutional backing. The assertive posturing worked exactly as my algorithms modeled. The local investors hesitated, completely unwilling to lock up that much capital against an anonymous corporate buyer who showed absolutely no signs of stopping. By 10:15, the field had thinned to just Valerie and the representative for the regional bank. The trap was ready to close. While Valerie was systematically outbidding the local investors on the courthouse steps, I opened a new browser window on my monitor and pulled up Maya's public Instagram profile. My sister-in-law was completely unbothered by the harsh reality of her financial situation. She was actively posting a continuous series of new video stories for her massive audience while standing in the gourmet kitchen of the Lake Geneva estate. She wore a perfectly tailored designer sweater and held a steaming mug of artisanal coffee. She smiled brightly into the camera lens and confidently assured her followers that her family was simply handling a very minor administrative hiccup regarding their property. She completely fabricated a narrative of total control, eagerly bragging about the grand luxury Thanksgiving dinner they were preparing to host at the lake house later that week. She even posted a digital poll asking her audience to vote on the premium floral arrangements for the dining table. The sheer level of their collective delusion was almost clinical to observe. My parents, Julian and Maya, firmly believed that their manipulative theatrical performance at the urgent care clinic had worked perfectly. They were sitting comfortably inside a multi-million-dollar house. They were actively losing, completely convinced that their discarded sister was going to walk into the Thanksgiving dinner carrying a cashier's check for $300,000 to save their fraudulent empire. They thought my financial compliance was absolutely guaranteed, and they were already celebrating a victory that did not exist. The bank representative placed their final protective bid, ensuring they covered their bottom line and mitigated their institutional risk. They expected the anonymous corporate buyer to eventually back down. Valerie did not flinch. Over the speakerphone, I instructed her to submit our final offer, surpassing the bank's absolute maximum threshold by a strategic and undeniable margin. The regional lender officially bowed out of the auction. The trustee called the final number 3 times and the auction concluded. My family always assumed I was simply hoarding my corporate salary out of spite. They never realized that true financial power is built quietly in the shadows. I did not fund this massive acquisition with fake internet money, empty promises, or fraudulent loans. I executed the purchase using the massive reserves of liquid capital I had quietly accumulated over 5 years of relentless labor. I combined my personal cash savings with my vested corporate stock bonuses and a pre-approved commercial mortgage secured entirely by my own flawless credit score. The transaction was executed with absolute surgical precision. By outbidding the bank, I effectively vaporized whatever remaining equity Julian thought he possessed. Every single dollar of value he claimed to own was completely consumed by the toxic debt he had accrued and the final declaration on those concrete steps. The rights to the property legally and permanently transferred. I officially absorbed the entire defaulted debt and transferred the deed of the Lake Geneva estate directly into the private holdings of Silent Waters, LLC. The very foundation my parents had deemed me too independent to inherit was now legally bound to my name. My phone screen illuminated on the brushed steel surface of my desk. A single text message from Valerie appeared on the display. It contained only 4 words. "The house is yours." I stared at the digital notification, waiting for a massive surge of adrenaline or a wave of emotional triumph to wash over me. I expected to feel the warm vindication of a discarded daughter finally claiming her rightful place. None of those emotions materialized. I did not feel joy or excitement. I only felt the chilling and absolute satisfaction of flawless mathematics. The power dynamic in my family completely inverted in that exact fraction of a second. I was no longer the unsuspecting victim of their federal identity theft. I was no longer the financial backup plan they could manipulate to subsidize my brother's endless failures. The regional bank was entirely out of the picture. By purchasing the defaulted debt through my anonymous corporate entity, I had officially become their ultimate creditor. I held the legal deed to the sprawling waterfront estate. I owned the timber, the soil, and the roof over their heads. I was now the landlord of my own family. I picked up my phone and locked the screen, plunging the display back into darkness. The legal trap was perfectly set, and the bait had been fully swallowed. My parents and my brother were currently sitting in a high-end restaurant, eagerly preparing to ambush me. They genuinely believed I was walking into that Thanksgiving dinner as a desperate and frightened daughter ready to hand over my life savings. I smoothed the lapel of my tailored blazer and grabbed my car keys. It was time to go to dinner and serve them the absolute reality of their ruin. The ambient lighting of the downtown Chicago steakhouse cast a warm golden glow over the dark mahogany walls and heavy brass fixtures. The air smelled of charred oak, seared ribeye, and expensive bourbon. It was the kind of establishment where corporate executives closed lucrative deals and politicians brokered quiet favors. My parents had chosen this specific location with precise tactical intent. They wanted an environment that demanded polite behavior. They assumed I would shrink under the weight of the upscale setting and the scrutiny of neighboring tables. I handed my coat to the hostess and followed her through the crowded dining room, carrying a sleek black leather portfolio tucked neatly under my arm. It looked like a standard corporate accessory, but it contained the architecture of their impending ruin. The hostess led me to a large private dining alcove situated in the back of the restaurant. As I approached, I saw the full cast of characters they had assembled for this theater production. My father sat at the center, looking remarkably vibrant for a man who had claimed to be suffering a fatal cardiac event just a few days prior. The pale, trembling patient from the urgent care clinic had miraculously vanished. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silk tie flushed with robust health and sheer arrogance. My mother sat to his right, draped in an elegant silk blouse, her posture rigid with practiced grace. Julian and Maya occupied the seats to my left, projecting an aura of absolute luxury, but they had not come alone. Sitting across from them were my aunts and uncles. The extended family represented the high court of our network. They were the arbiters of reputation, the very people who had spent the weekend flooding my inbox with toxic accusations. My parents had invited the jury to watch the execution. They stacked the deck, ensuring I would face a wall of collective disapproval if I refused their financial demands. I slid into the plush leather booth, placing my portfolio flat on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of me. The performance began the absolute second I took my seat. My mother reached across the table, her face arranged into a mask of overwhelming maternal warmth. She grasped my hands, squeezing them tight, and offered a bright, artificial smile. She told me how beautiful I looked. She complimented my tailored blazer and asked about my drive. My aunts leaned forward, their heavy diamond earrings catching the ambient light. They chimed in, echoing the sudden, bizarre affection. For the first time in my entire life, they initiated a conversation centered entirely on my professional achievements. They raised their water glasses in a mock toast, praising my position as a forensic accountant. They used words like brilliant, ambitious, and driven. The very traits they had previously labeled as cold and selfish were suddenly being reframed as incredible virtues. They called me the absolute pride of the family and the ultimate savior of our legacy. They were executing a classic psychological maneuver known as love bombing. By flooding the target with unexpected praise and validation, the manipulator attempts to create a deep sense of indebtedness. They were buttering me up for the slaughter, softening my defenses before presenting the massive invoice. I accepted their compliments with a polite, vacant smile. I did not reciprocate the warmth. The waiter arrived to distribute the leather-bound menus and take the drink orders. This mundane interaction provided a glaring window into the true nature of their absolute delusion. Julian, a man facing imminent homelessness and total federal investigation, did not hesitate. He did not open the standard beverage menu. He and Maya requested the reserve wine list. They flipped through the pages with practiced ease and selected 2 bottles of a boutique Napa Valley Cabernet. The price listed beside the vintage was over $200 a bottle. They did not glance at my father. They did not ask permission. They ordered luxury items on a Thursday night while actively begging for hundreds of thousands of dollars in charity. Julian operated on the fundamental ingrained belief that someone else would always cover the check. In his mind, I was not merely the solution to his real estate crisis. I was the designated wallet for the entire evening. He assumed the quiet, responsible sister would silently absorb the cost of his indulgence, just as she was expected to absorb the cost of his defaulted loans. I placed my hand over my empty glass, declining the wine. I required an absolutely clear head for the remaining acts of this play. The dinner service progressed with agonizing slowness. Sizzling cuts of prime beef and towering salads were consumed amidst a steady stream of polite, empty chatter. Eventually, the waiter returned to clear the empty porcelain plates. The casual phase of the evening officially concluded. The atmosphere around the large alcove shifted instantly. The forced laughter faded, replaced by a sudden heavy silence. My aunts and uncles sat up straighter, their expressions settling into masks of serious expectation. My father shifted his posture, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the edge of the mahogany table. He cleared his throat using a low, authoritative sound designed to command the attention of the entire group. The transition to business had officially arrived. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. His fingers emerged holding a single folded legal document printed on thick, high-quality parchment paper. He did not speak immediately. He let the visual weight of the paperwork establish the severity of the moment. He smoothed the crease with his thumb, his face projecting the solemn, burdened expression of a patriarch forced to make difficult decisions for the greater good of his bloodline. With a slow, deliberate motion, he applied pressure to the top of the document and pushed it across the smooth white tablecloth. The paper glided over the fabric, crossing the empty space between our plates. It stopped moving exactly when the leading edge made contact with the bottom of my black leather portfolio. I looked down. It was a drafted personal loan agreement for $300,000. He had padded the original debt amount, likely to cover Julian's legal fees and Maya's incoming luxury credit card bills. My father did not break eye contact as the legal document settled in front of me. He spoke with the exact cadence of a seasoned politician presenting a closing argument to a highly sympathetic jury. He painted a vivid picture of a family under absolute siege by faceless corporate greed. He leaned in closer and lowered his voice to a dramatic whisper. He told me that a ruthless predatory investment group known as Silent Waters had just seized the Lake Geneva property during a moment of temporary financial vulnerability. He claimed this anonymous corporation was holding our generational heritage hostage. But then his tone shifted from mournful to triumphant. He presented his ultimate solution. He told me he needed me to write a cashier's check for the full $300,000 right now. He insisted that if I provided the capital, our family could approach this faceless corporation and buy our legacy right back from them. He pointed his finger at the parchment paper and demanded I sign the agreement to save them all from absolute ruin. I looked at the heavy parchment paper. I looked at the silver pen resting beside it. I did not reach for either of them. Instead, I unzipped the black leather portfolio resting directly in front of me. The metallic sound of the zipper cut sharply through the soft jazz playing over the restaurant speakers. I reached inside and retrieved a completely different stack of papers. These were not printed on expensive parchment. They were standard printer paper carrying the stark and undeniable weight of federal banking records. I selected the top document from my stack and moved my arm, placing it directly over my father's drafted loan agreement. I literally buried his fabricated solution under the undeniable evidence of his actual crime. I smoothed the top page with my palm and spoke with the precise, measured tone I used to brief executive stakeholders during a corporate fraud investigation. I addressed the entire table, making absolutely sure my aunts and uncles heard every single syllable. I tapped my index finger on the final page of the bank document right beside the designated guarantor section. I instructed the extended family to look closely at the signature line. I explained that 2 years ago, someone sat in a bank office and pledged my pristine credit score, my corporate salary, and my entire legal identity to secure a financial lifeline for Julian. I pointed to the cursive loops forming my name and stated plainly that I had never seen this document before Christmas morning. The air in the private dining alcove grew incredibly still. The murmurs of family loyalty and the fake praise ceased instantly. I looked directly at my mother, identifying her distinct slanted handwriting for the entire table to see. I informed the group that my parents and my brother had committed federal identity theft and wire fraud. I laid it out bare, telling them they had hijacked my financial future to sustain Julian's luxury lifestyle and Maya's internet facade. The reaction from the jury was immediate and visceral. My aunts gasped, raising their hands to their mouths in genuine, unadulterated shock. The uncles recoiled, pressing their backs against the plush leather seating as if the papers on the table were suddenly toxic. The warm, approving smiles they had directed at my parents vanished in a fraction of a second. The high court of the extended family network had walked into this restaurant ready to criticize my selfishness, but they were now witnessing a massive felony exposure in real time. The narrative they had been fed completely shattered against the undeniable reality of the paper trail. Julian lost his arrogant posture instantly. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth to stammer a weak excuse, attempting to minimize a federal offense into a minor clerical oversight. I did not let him speak. I reached into my portfolio for the second layer of their ruin. I pulled out the federal commercial registration and the tax filings for the shell company they had illegally established in my name. I dropped the heavy stack of tax documents right on top of the forged bank loans. I turned my gaze directly toward Maya. She was sitting frozen in her seat, her perfectly manicured hands trembling over her expensive wine glass. I addressed the entire table again, but my focus was entirely on my sister-in-law. I explained that stealing $250,000 from a regional bank was only half of their operation. I told the extended family exactly how Julian and Maya had been funding their glamorous internet lifestyle. I pointed to the tax records outlining how they had funneled massive amounts of undocumented income through a fake corporate entity. They had actively classified Maya's luxury handbags, first-class flights to Dubai, and private beach cabanas as fabricated business losses to completely evade federal taxes. Maya let out a sharp gasp. The wealthy influencer facade she had carefully curated for 500,000 followers completely disintegrated right there in the dining room. I told her I knew exactly what they were doing, and I refused to go to a federal prison to protect her social media aesthetic. I announced to the incredibly silent table that I had already retained a corporate attorney. I informed Julian and Maya that my lawyer had preemptively filed a sworn fraud affidavit and handed their entire unredacted financial ledger directly over to the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government now possessed every single receipt. My aunts and uncles stared at Maya with pure, unadulterated disgust, realizing her entire online empire was built on stolen identity and blatant tax fraud. Maya realized in that exact moment that she was not just going to lose her house. The federal agents were coming to seize every single designer item she owned. My father could no longer maintain his facade of the burdened patriarch. The polished exterior cracked, completely revealing the raw and frantic panic underneath. He realized the social trap he had set had closed squarely on his own neck. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He raised a clenched fist and brought it down hard against the mahogany edge of the table, making the expensive silverware rattle against the porcelain plates. He leaned over the table with wild eyes. He shouted that he did not care about the forged documents or the tax evasion anymore. He screamed that the fraud was completely irrelevant right now because the regional lender no longer owned the property. He pointed a shaking finger at his drafted loan agreement. He yelled that a faceless corporation named Silent Waters had already finalized the auction and currently held the keys to our family heritage. He demanded I stop playing legal games and immediately sign the $300,000 check so he could go negotiate with this anonymous investment group before they changed the locks. I looked at his desperate, flushed face. I did not blink. I agreed with his assessment of the real estate situation. I told him he was absolutely accurate. The waterfront estate did indeed belong to a private corporation now. I ignored his silver pen. I reached into the back pocket of my black leather portfolio for the very last time. My fingers found a single crisp page bearing the embossed gold seal of the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. I extracted the document and brought it into the warm amber light of the chandelier. I did not hand it to my father. I placed my fingertips on the top edge of the heavy paper and slid it directly across the white tablecloth. The header of the page read, "Articles of Organization." My father snatched the paper from the table, holding it up to the ambient light. He read the bold font identifying the newly formed legal entity known as Silent Waters, LLC. His eyes frantically scanned the paragraphs until he reached the final section designating the registered owner. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp guttural wheeze. There, printed in stark black ink under the heading of sole proprietor, was my name. The silence in the private dining alcove became absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. The soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers seemed to fade into a dull, meaningless hum. My father stared at the gold seal on the paper, completely unable to process the words. He could not breathe. He let out a ragged, wheezing gasp as his commanding patriarch facade completely dissolved. The man who had weaponized my competence to justify his favoritism was now being instantly crushed by that exact same competence. Julian sat frozen in his plush leather chair, trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the heavy mahogany table just to steady his hands. The golden child finally grasped the brutal reality of his situation. He possessed no equity, and he held absolutely no leverage. His future rested entirely in the palm of my hand. The realization hit Maya so hard her perfectly manicured fingers simply went limp. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped from her grasp and shattered loudly against a porcelain plate. Dark red wine spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like a deep stain. The extended family watched the ultimate inversion of power unfold in real time. The social currency my parents had hoarded for decades evaporated in a single terrifying moment. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I maintained direct eye contact with my father, ensuring he absorbed the full, crushing weight of the trap he had built for himself. I reached out and tapped my index finger twice against the corporate registration document. I pitched my voice to carry clearly across the quiet space. I told him he was not trying to buy the waterfront estate back from a faceless corporate investment group. I told him he was sitting at this table actively begging to buy the family legacy back from me, and it is absolutely not for sale. Julian stared at the articles of organization as his mind desperately scrambled to reframe the massive disaster. The golden child had spent his entire life completely insulated from consequences, and his brain simply refused to process the concept of accountability. He leaned across the table, knocking over a silver salt shaker, and offered a weak, trembling smile. His eyes were suddenly shining with delusional relief. He actually let out a breathless, uneven laugh and looked at our parents as if presenting a miracle. He told the table that I had bought the estate for them. He stammered that I used my corporate money to outbid the investors just to keep the property in the family. He reached out, attempting to grasp my hand. He whined that he knew I would not let him lose his home and suggested we could just transfer the deed back into a family trust. He assumed my actions were driven by the same blind loyalty our parents had always demanded. He truly believed the universe existed solely to serve his needs, and that I was just another mechanism designed to facilitate his comfort. I pulled my arm back completely, denying him the contact. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I reached into my black leather portfolio for the very last time. My fingers grasped a crisp, legal-sized document printed on official letterhead from my attorney's law firm. It was not a suggestion, and it was certainly not an invitation to negotiate. I placed the paper onto the white tablecloth and slid it directly toward my brother. I told him I did not buy the estate to save him. I purchased it because my predictive algorithms identified it as a highly lucrative distressed asset. I stated clearly that the document in front of him was a formal 30-day notice to vacate. As the sole proprietor of Silent Waters LLC, I was legally evicting him from the premises. He had exactly 1 month to pack his belongings and surrender the keys to my property management firm. Julian stared at the eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language. He began to cry loudly, sobbing into his hands as the reality of his ruin finally pierced his protective bubble. My mother opened her mouth to scream an insult, but I raised a single index finger, silencing her instantly. The time for debate had completely expired. It was time to establish the final, impenetrable boundary. I instructed them to listen to me very carefully. I told them the 30-day eviction notice was absolutely non-negotiable. I tapped the high-resolution scan of the forged deed of trust still resting on the table. I told them I knew exactly how spiteful people behave when they lose a luxury property. I laid down my absolute condition. I stated that if a single nail was removed from the walls, if a single hardwood floorboard was intentionally scratched, or if any fixtures were damaged on their way out, I would not bother pursuing civil damages. I promised them I would walk the forgery evidence directly to the county sheriff. I would immediately file the police report for federal identity theft and tax evasion, and I would personally ensure the prosecution sought the absolute maximum sentencing guidelines. I looked my mother and my brother directly in the eyes and told them they would trade the lake house for a federal prison cell. The threat hung in the ambient lighting of the steakhouse, heavy, definitive, and backed entirely by the rigid structure of the law. They knew I was not bluffing. My mother sank back into the booth, all the fight completely draining out of her trembling frame, while Julian buried his face in his hands, weeping over the empire he had finally lost. 30 days later, I drove my car up the long, winding driveway of the Lake Geneva property. The crunch of the gravel under my tires was the only sound echoing through the crisp autumn air. I parked in front of the massive oak doors and stepped out. I did not need to knock or ask for permission. I pulled the heavy brass key from my coat pocket and unlocked the front door. The house was completely silent. I walked through the grand foyer, and my footsteps echoed against the bare hardwood floors. They had followed my instructions with absolute terrifying precision. The expensive furniture was gone. The modern art had been stripped from the walls. They did not dare leave a single scratch on the baseboards or a single scuff on the pristine floor. The threat of a federal prison cell had been the ultimate motivator. The sprawling waterfront estate was entirely empty. The physical emptiness of the house was nothing compared to the absolute collapse of my brother's curated reality. The Internal Revenue Service did not waste any time after my attorney handed over the unredacted financial ledgers. The federal agents moved swiftly and silently, freezing every single bank account tied to the shell company. Maya's luxurious influencer lifestyle shattered practically overnight. When the government seized their assets, the internet immediately took notice. Her massive online audience realized her entire brand was funded by stolen money and federal tax evasion. The public backlash was absolutely ruthless. Every major corporate sponsor dropped her within 48 hours. With zero income and frozen accounts, they were forced to abandon their luxury aesthetic completely. The couple who used to drink $200 wine on a random Thursday night was now living in a cramped, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city, desperately trying to hide from the public eye. My parents faced a completely different kind of ruin. Their entire existence revolved around social status and the approval of their wealthy peers. But the dinner at the downtown steakhouse had permanently destroyed their pristine reputation. My aunts and uncles had witnessed the undeniable proof of federal identity theft, and they wasted absolutely no time spreading the truth to every single person in their elite circle. The social execution was swift and total. My parents were quietly asked to resign from their exclusive country club. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their phone calls, and their invitations to high society events completely vanished. The extended family cut all ties, treating them like walking financial liabilities. They were left with nothing but their massive debt, and each other trapped in a cold, isolated reality of their own making. I stood in the center of the massive living room, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the calm, gray waters of the lake. I did not feel a single trace of guilt. I had simply applied the exact same cold, analytical logic they had always criticized me for, and used it to completely dismantle their toxic empire. They thought they could use my identity as a shield and discard me when the financial bomb detonated. Instead, I absorbed their entire legacy and turned it into my own personal asset. The house was no longer a monument to my brother's entitlement or my parents' manipulation. It was just a clean and highly profitable piece of real estate in my corporate portfolio. I turned away from the glass, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and drove back to Chicago. I did not let the waterfront property sit empty for long. Within a week, I hired a premier architectural design firm from Chicago to completely gut the interior of the Lake Geneva estate. I directed the contractors to tear down the walls that held decades of toxic family history. We ripped out the dated mahogany paneling and the pretentious chandeliers my mother had spent years bragging about. In their place, the designers installed sleek, modern fixtures, open-concept meeting spaces, and state-of-the-art telecommunication systems. I systematically erased every single trace of my parents and my brother from the physical space. The sprawling house was no longer a monument to unearned privilege. I transformed it into an exclusive high-end corporate retreat specifically designed for senior executives and elite board of directors. The same financial algorithms I used to uncover the massive federal fraud were now generating perfectly optimized commercial rental rates. Major tech companies and corporate law firms began booking the estate for their quarterly leadership summits, paying incredible premium prices for the absolute privacy and the stunning lake views. The massive amounts of cash flowing into the accounts of Silent Waters LLC were entirely passive. Every single month, the very generational legacy that was explicitly designed to exclude me deposited a massive dividend directly into my own bank account. My family had spent my entire life telling me I was too cold and too calculating to ever understand the true emotional value of our heritage. They were absolutely right about me being calculating. I simply calculated that their beloved family sanctuary was worth much more to me as a highly lucrative commercial asset than it ever was as a home. For years, society tried to sell me a very specific definition of family. People will constantly tell you that blood is thicker than water and that you must always forgive the people who share your genetic code. But my career in forensic accounting taught me to look past the emotional narrative and focus entirely on the hard data. The data tells a completely different story about human nature. True independence is not just about having a high credit score or paying your own utility bills on time. True independence is the absolute ability to ruthlessly slam the door in the face of anyone who tries to use family loyalty as a weapon to drain your peace of mind. Sharing a biological connection with someone does not magically grant them a legal license to commit financial fraud against you. A toxic family member will always demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. They will call you cold and selfish the exact moment you finally refuse to hand over the matches. You are absolutely never obligated to subsidize the delusions of people who view you as nothing more than a convenient emergency fund. You have the fundamental right to walk away from anyone who only values you for what they can extract from you. Take a very close look at the ledgers of your own life. Audit the people around you and measure exactly what they bring to your life versus what they constantly take away. Do not let guilt force you into a bad investment. Protect your Social Security number, protect your banking data, and secure your financial accounts. But above everything else, protect your peace. You worked far too hard to build your sanctuary. Never let anyone use the excuse of blood to burn your future to the ground.